In every major port, thousands of containers move quietly across borders each day, filled with electronics, clothing, food, and medicine. Yet hidden among these legitimate goods are shipments that never appear on any official manifest. Fake pharmaceuticals, unregistered gold, trafficked wildlife, and encrypted data packets travel the same routes, handled with the same precision, and financed by an invisible network that mirrors the legitimate world it parasitizes. This is the shadow economy, a vast and adaptive ecosystem that thrives beyond regulation, feeding off the gaps between nations, laws, and technologies. It is as old as trade itself, yet more powerful and elusive than ever before. From the smugglers who once ferried silk and spices along ancient trade routes to today's digital traffickers operating through encrypted servers and cryptocurrencies, illicit commerce has evolved hand in hand with civilization's progress. But to call it smuggling is to misunderstand its scale. These aren't isolated crimes committed in dark alleys. They are coordinated enterprises, transnational in reach and corporate in structure. They employ accountants, logisticians, software engineers, and money launderers who understand global markets better than many policymakers do. Together, they form a multi-trillion-dollar economy that challenges the authority of states, destabilizes markets, and exploits millions in silence. Beyond the sensational headlines and dramatic buzz lies a deeper story, one about ingenuity, inequality, and the relentless pursuit of profit. This investigation traces the hidden architecture of the shadow economy, how it was built, how it sustains itself, and what it reveals about the world we've created. From forgotten smugglers who laid the groundwork for modern logistics to the encrypted empires of the dark web, we'll explore not just how these networks operate, but why they endure and what it will take to dismantle them. The story of the modern cartel begins in the shadows of history, where ambition, geography, and opportunity collided to create networks that would forever reshape the drug trade. Colombia, with its rugged mountains, dense jungles, and sprawling ports, became the unlikely cradle of an empire built on secrecy and ruthlessness. In the 1970s, as global demand for cocaine surged, a new breed of criminal organization emerged, one that was bold enough to challenge governments, sophisticated enough to exploit logistic systems, and violent enough to enforce obedience without question. Pablo Escobar, who would become the most infamous figure of this era, was only one piece of a larger puzzle. Early operations were modest by today's standards. Small shipments of cocaine leaving Colombia in airplanes and boats, funneled through the Caribbean to the United States. But even these early networks required organization, trust, and strategy. Mules carried cash and product across borders, pilots coordinated clandestine flights into Florida and New York, and intermediaries kept entire communities complicit or silent. Every actor in the chain, from local farmers to middlemen in Miami, was a node in a growing web of illicit commerce. By the early 1980s, Escobar's Medellin cartel had perfected a distribution model that resembled a multinational corporation more than a criminal gang. There were accountants, logistics experts, and front businesses that laundered millions in revenue each week. Safe houses dotted the city, equipped with escape routes and reinforced walls. Radio scanners monitored law enforcement communications, and early encryption techniques were used to keep messages private. The cartel's operations were global in scope long before most governments recognized the threat. They sourced precursor chemicals from Europe and the United States, coordinated with smugglers in Central America, and maintained fleets of aircraft capable of moving tons of product. Violence was an instrument as much as a weapon. Murders, kidnappings, and bombings were used not only to protect territory, but to send a clear message. Resistance came at a cost. Politicians, journalists, and police officers were coerced or bribed into compliance, creating an environment where the rule of law could be bent or broken entirely. The Medellin cartel's reach extended beyond Colombia, touching financial institutions in Panama, drug distribution networks in Miami, and street-level dealers across the United States. Meanwhile, the Cali cartel, which emerged in the 1980s as a rival to Medellin, took a different approach. Less flashy and more calculated, Cali operated like a Fortune 500 company. Their focus was on corporate-style management, careful money laundering, and minimizing violence in public spaces. Whereas Medellin thrived on fear and spectacle, Cali excelled at subtlety, embedding itself into legal businesses, banks, and political structures. The organization developed complex networks for smuggling, including legitimate shipping containers and covert routes across the Caribbean and Europe. It was a system designed to maximize efficiency while minimizing attention, an early example of criminal enterprise learning from legitimate business practices. By the 1990s, as law enforcement pressure mounted in Colombia, Mexico began to rise as the epicenter of cartel activity. Organizations like the Sinaloa Federation expanded from small-scale operations into transnational networks, learning lessons from the successes and failures of their Colombian predecessors. They refined trafficking methods, diversified routes, and invested in technology to evade detection. While violence remained a constant, there was an increasing emphasis on logistics, finance, and the strategic use of legitimate businesses as fronts. Airplanes, tunnels, and even fishing vessels became tools in a highly organized supply chain. Throughout this evolution, certain roles became crucial. Mules carried drugs across borders, often risking life and liberty for relatively small pay. Fixers coordinated shipments, navigated corrupt officials, and managed risk. Financiers moved enormous sums of cash through banks, currency exchanges, and offshore accounts, making the operation sustainable. The system was interdependent. If one link failed, the chain could collapse, yet the networks were resilient, learning from mistakes and adapting quickly to new enforcement tactics. What stands out in the rise of these cartels is their ability to professionalize. They borrowed techniques from legitimate businesses, hierarchies of authority, division of labor, and strategic planning. Supply routes were mapped and optimized. Cash flow was monitored meticulously, with accountants ensuring that revenue was reinvested into operations, security, and influence. The combination of brute force and meticulous planning created organizations capable of surviving assaults from both rivals and the state. The human cost of these operations was immense. Communities were trapped between coercion and complicity. Families were torn apart by addiction, violence, and fear. Law enforcement agents who resisted corruption risked assassination. Even within the cartels, loyalty was fragile, enforced through terror and rewards alike. It was a world where power was measured in both money and blood, and where one misstep could be fatal. Yet, despite the violence and corruption, these cartels endured, in part because they understood the fundamentals of human behavior and commerce. They exploited demand, manipulated legal systems, and created complex networks that were difficult to dismantle. Every shipment, bribe, and alliance was part of a larger strategy, one that allowed these organizations to operate for decades despite the best efforts of authorities. As Chapter 1 closes, it becomes clear that the story of the cartels is not merely a tale of criminals and violence. It is a story of organization, adaptability, and the shadowy interplay between legality and illegality. From the mountains of Colombia to the streets of Mexico, these networks created a blueprint for illicit enterprise that continues to influence global crime today. They showed that smuggling, once a simple act of concealment, could evolve into a sophisticated system of commerce complete with logistics, finance, and global reach. And in doing so, they laid the groundwork for the modern shadow economy, one that would challenge governments, redefine borders, and remind the world that wherever there is demand, ingenuity, legal or otherwise, will find a way to supply it. By the late 1990s, the landscape of illicit trade had shifted. The Colombian strongholds of Medellin and Cali had been dismantled through a combination of law enforcement pressure, extradition treaties, and internal betrayals, but their lessons endured. Mexican organizations, most notably the Sinaloa Federation, began to dominate the cocaine trade, not merely by force, but through a level of organization and technological sophistication that rivaled legitimate multinational corporations. The era of brute spectacle was giving way to a new era of logistics, encryption, and global networks. Technology became both a shield and a weapon. Communications that had once relied on radios and couriers were now moving across encrypted channels, making surveillance by authorities exponentially more difficult. Satellite phones, early internet communication, and digital encryption allowed cartel leaders to coordinate operations across continents without leaving fingerprints on a single document. Even as governments invested in sophisticated monitoring tools, the cartels adapted, creating counter-surveillance techniques, using disposable phones and routing messages through a complex web of intermediaries. Cryptocurrency emerged as a quiet revolution in cartel finance. By the 2010s, digital currencies allowed for cross-border transactions that were harder to trace than traditional wire transfers. While governments scrambled to understand Bitcoin and its alternatives, cartels quietly tested the waters, moving money with speed, anonymity, and minimal oversight. Combined with traditional money laundering techniques, shell companies, cash smuggling, and real estate investments cartels had transformed financial risk into a manageable, almost corporate problem. Globalization expanded both opportunity and complexity. Ports in the United States, Europe, and Asia became critical nodes in the smuggling network. Cartels diversified routes, shifting shipments from traditional Caribbean pathways to Pacific routes, air transport, and even semi-legitimate maritime trade. Cargo containers filled with textiles, electronics, and agricultural goods often concealed kilogram after kilogram of illicit product. Front companies, some completely unaware of the illicit cargo in their shipments, became unwitting collaborators in the global network. Others were willing participants, incentivized by profit, coercion, or shared interest. Yet even with global reach and digital tools, the cartels retained a human face in their operations. Fixers coordinated with corrupt officials, often navigating layers of bureaucracy to ensure shipments moved unimpeded. Mules carried drugs, money, and documents across borders, risking imprisonment or death. Drivers, pilots, and low-level operatives executed the day-to-day logistics that algorithms could not replace. The networks were a blend of high-tech systems and old-school personal risk, a duality that made them resilient and adaptive. The cartels also learned from the structure of legitimate business in remarkable ways. Distribution was mapped meticulously. Stock levels were monitored. Supply routes were optimized to avoid bottlenecks and law enforcement detection. Territories were divided, and alliances negotiated with precision. Even the internal hierarchy mirrored corporate organization. Leaders, lieutenants, logisticians, accountants, and security chiefs all performed specialized functions, creating a division of labor that allowed the enterprise to function on a massive scale. Global trade created unexpected advantages for these networks. The sheer volume of legitimate goods moving through ports, airports, and highways provided cover. Cargo scanners could not check every container, and customs agents were often overworked or under-resourced. Corruption, long a tool of organized crime, allowed certain shipments to pass with minimal scrutiny. By combining legal infrastructure with covert methods, the cartels could move ton after ton of product without detection, reinforcing the idea that supply chains, legal or illegal, could be optimized with intelligence and planning. The digital revolution further expanded possibilities. Dark web marketplaces allowed for anonymous transactions and created virtual storefronts for certain drugs and contraband. While these platforms represented only a small fraction of total operations, they demonstrated the adaptability of cartels to changing environments. Even in cyberspace, the principles remained the same. Control the supply, manage the risk, and maximize profit. And just as with physical operations, human trust, enforcement, and discipline were embedded into these networks. Violence, while less theatrical than in the Medellin era, remained an instrument of strategy. Cartels used it selectively to maintain loyalty, enforce contracts, intimidate competitors, and signal authority to both communities and authorities. Assassinations, kidnappings, and ambushes were deployed with precision rather than spectacle, reflecting the growing professionalism and strategic calculation of the organizations. The goal was not chaos for its own sake, but control over territory, routes, and influence. The globalization of illicit networks also meant that disruption in one region could ripple across the world. Law enforcement actions in Mexico affected cocaine availability in the United States, which in turn influenced prices, competition, and territorial disputes in Colombia and beyond. The networks were not static. They adapted constantly, shifting operations in response to enforcement pressure, market demand, and technological developments. The modern cartel was less a local criminal gang and more a transnational enterprise capable of managing complex, multi-layered operations. Human cost has always remained high. Communities along trafficking routes endured violence, intimidation, and the social disruption that comes with large-scale drug operations. Families were caught between fear and necessity, and young people were often drawn into the network, either willingly or under duress. While cartels optimized logistics and finance, they could not erase the human consequences of their enterprise. Addiction, poverty, and corruption were constant side effects, woven into the global system they had created. By the early 21st century, cartels had reached an unprecedented level of sophistication. They were not just smuggling organizations, they were logistics experts, financial managers, and political negotiators. The use of encryption, digital finance, and global trade networks had made the illicit supply chain more resilient and adaptable than ever. And as governments developed new strategies to combat them, the cartels evolved in turn, demonstrating an agility that was as much about intelligence and planning as it was about violence and coercion. Chapter 2 closes on the realization that modern cartels operate in a world shaped by both human ingenuity and systemic opportunity. The networks that began as small, localized smuggling rings had transformed into transnational enterprises, exploiting global trade, technology, and finance with precision. They were agile, adaptive, and ever-present, a reminder that the shadow economy thrives wherever there is demand, ingenuity, and a willingness to operate beyond the law. The fight against them is not just about raids, arrests, or borders. It is about understanding the complex systems that allow these networks to function and the global structures that both enable and challenge their existence. If there was one lesson the modern cartels had learned from their predecessors, it was that survival depended on adaptability. The Colombian cartels of the 1980s had been spectacular, violent, and visible, but their downfall had taught a generation of traffickers that subtlety, diversification, and careful planning were more valuable than theatrics. The Sinaloa Federation, along with emerging networks across Mexico and Central America, exemplified this lesson, building operations that were leaner, more flexible, and strikingly corporate in structure. At the heart of their success was an understanding of the principles that drive legitimate businesses. Every operation had to account for supply and demand, distribution, human resources, and risk management. Territories were divided, responsibilities delegated, and hierarchies established with efficiency in mind. Leaders acted as CEOs, lieutenants as division heads, and logistics coordinators as supply chain managers. Money laundering became a sophisticated function akin to corporate finance. Investments in real estate, front companies, and international banking networks masked the flow of hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Unlike the Medellin cartel, which often relied on fear and spectacle, the modern cartels understood that predictability was dangerous. Flexibility was paramount. Routes could change overnight. Shipments rerouted through new ports or tunnels in response to law enforcement pressure. Couriers were rotated, mules replaced, and communication systems updated constantly. When a particular pathway became too risky, the network pivoted, demonstrating an almost uncanny ability to adapt without missing a beat. Technology was leveraged as both a shield and a scalpel. GPS tracking, encrypted communications, and surveillance countermeasures allowed leadership to monitor operations in real time. They could track shipments, coordinate multiple teams, and even predict law enforcement patterns, reducing losses and ensuring efficiency. In many ways, these networks resembled multinational logistics companies, with contingency plans, data analysis, and chain of command oversight embedded at every level. Violence, while still present, had become targeted rather than indiscriminate. It was a tool of strategic enforcement, designed to maintain loyalty, eliminate competition, and reinforce authority. Hitmen were deployed not for chaos, but for control precision instruments in a carefully managed organizational machine. The use of intimidation, bribes, and strategic alliances allowed the cartels to operate in regions where formal governance was weak, turning local officials, business owners, and even rival networks into partners or neutralized threats. The parallels with corporate models extended beyond structure and discipline. Cartels conducted market research, monitoring trends in drug consumption, pricing fluctuations, and competitive pressures. They understood that customer demand dictated strategy. If cocaine demand in the United States dropped, diversification into marijuana, methamphetamines, or heroin could stabilize revenue. Contracts with distributors were treated as enforceable agreements, reinforced through both loyalty incentives and the ever-present threat of violence. In effect, the modern cartel functioned as a shadow corporation, illegal, brutal, but professionally managed. The internal culture of these networks reinforced efficiency and adaptability. Loyalty was rewarded with promotion, money, and protection. Betrayal was punished swiftly and publicly. Training and knowledge transfer were systematic. New recruits learned operational procedures, communication protocols, and risk management strategies. The organization was not dependent on a single leader. Succession plans and decentralized management allowed the network to survive arrests, deaths, or betrayals. Leadership became a role defined by strategic oversight rather than mere fear. Adaptation extended to external threats as well. Government crackdowns, military interventions, and international sanctions prompted constant evolution. Cartels innovated with tunnels under border crossings, semi-submersible vessels to transport drugs via the Pacific, and creative concealment methods in otherwise legitimate shipments. When one mode of operation was compromised, the networks quickly shifted, demonstrating a resilience that was difficult for law enforcement to match. Every challenge became an opportunity to refine processes, increase security, and strengthen control over the supply chain. Even the global financial system was co-opted to serve their purposes. Banks, exchange houses, and real estate markets were exploited to launder billions, turning illicit profits into tangible assets. Cartels learned the importance of compliance-like appearances, adopting the facade of legal business while their core operations remained clandestine. The result was an organization that could function at scale, survive scrutiny, and expand into new territories without drawing immediate attention. What made these operations particularly formidable was their combination of human intelligence and technological sophistication. On the ground, street-level operatives, drivers, and couriers ensured that the physical movement of drugs was executed flawlessly. Simultaneously, leadership monitored operations with digital tools, coordinated complex logistics, and managed finances across borders. The interplay of human and technological systems created a network that was both agile and robust, capable of absorbing shocks that would cripple lesser organizations. Despite the ruthless efficiency, there was always a human element that no algorithm could replace. Negotiation, intimidation, and relationship management remained essential. Cartel leaders cultivated networks of influence that extended into politics, law enforcement, and local communities. Bribes, favors, and threats maintained compliance. But the networks also relied on trust and reputation, and understanding that one wrong move could destabilize an entire operation. These social dynamics were as critical to the business as logistics and finance. Ultimately, the modern cartel became a blueprint for illicit enterprise. It demonstrated how criminal organizations could borrow from legitimate business practices to maximize efficiency, minimize risk, and survive under intense pressure. The combination of strategy, adaptability, and resilience allowed these networks not only to endure, but to thrive in an environment that constantly sought to dismantle them. Chapter 3 closes with a recognition that the power of these networks lies not merely in drugs or money, but in their structure, intelligence, and adaptability. They operate like shadow corporations, combining logistics, finance, and human management to create a resilient, globalized enterprise. Understanding these mechanisms is crucial to comprehending how cartels maintain influence, expand operations, and persist despite decades of enforcement efforts. Their success is a testament to the application of organization, strategy, and adaptability principles that, if applied legally, could make any enterprise formidable. In the hands of these criminals, however, these same principles perpetuate violence, corruption, and instability across entire regions. By the early 21st century, the rise of sophisticated cartel networks had created a shadow world parallel to legitimate society. These organizations were no longer just smuggling operations. They were deeply embedded enterprises with tentacles reaching into politics, finance, law enforcement, and everyday communities. Yet while leaders managed empires of illicit commerce with precision, the human toll was staggering, a cost measured not in profit, but in lives, trust, and social stability. In regions where cartels held sway, ordinary citizens lived in a delicate balance between fear and complicity. Families in rural Colombia, Mexico, and Central America often found themselves caught in the crossfire of territorial disputes. Children grew up with a stark choice: become a pawn in the network, flee their homes, or face the violence of a system in which neutrality was almost impossible. Schools and clinics were often collateral damage, either neglected or coerced into compliance. Addictions spread in tandem with the drugs themselves, creating cycles of poverty and dependency that were nearly impossible to escape. Corruption became both a tool and a survival mechanism. Law enforcement officers, politicians, and business leaders were frequently bribed or intimidated into compliance. The cartels understood that exerting influence over the system could be far more effective than challenging it directly. Entire municipalities were shaped by these covert arrangements, where contracts, permits, and police protection were often contingent on allegiance or fear. Governments, constrained by resources, legal frameworks, and internal politics, struggled to assert control in regions where the cartel's reach was absolute. Even in countries with stronger institutions, the cartel's globalized operations created challenges that conventional law enforcement was ill-equipped to handle. Cross-border trafficking, encrypted communications, and sophisticated money laundering allowed the networks to operate at scale with minimal disruption. When one cell was dismantled, another emerged, often stronger, wiser, and more resilient. The systems were adaptive, learning from failures and exploiting loopholes in both law and geography. Raids and arrests, while symbolically powerful, rarely disrupted the enterprise at its core. The violence that made headlines, assassinations of politicians, public executions, and mass killings, was only the tip of a far larger, more insidious iceberg. The everyday consequences of cartel activity were far less visible, but deeply destructive. Farmers coerced into cultivating coca or poppy crops faced threats from both traffickers and government eradication programs. Local businesses were forced to pay protection fees or risk arson and theft. Communities became normalized to corruption and fear, making intervention more complicated and prolonged. The social fabric itself was under siege. Yet the cartel's human cost extended inward as well. Members were bound by loyalty, enforced through fear, with betrayal punished harshly. Operatives risked their lives daily to transport drugs, move money, or carry out violent enforcement. Leadership structures were brutal but methodical, Discipline, obedience, and results were valued above all, creating an internal culture that was both efficient and perilous. Even those at the top lived with constant threat rivals, law enforcement, and even former allies could undo years of planning in an instant. The price of success in this world was vigilance and ruthlessness. Governments and law enforcement agencies, recognizing that traditional tactics often failed, began experimenting with new strategies. Intelligence-led operations, international task forces, and financial crackdowns sought to attack the network's infrastructure rather than its low-level operatives. Programs aimed at reducing demand, rehabilitating addicts, and offering alternatives to illicit cultivation attempted to strike at root causes. Still, the battle was uneven. The cartel's ability to adapt, innovate, and leverage global systems often outpaced these efforts. In some regions, innovative approaches began to show results. Community engagement programs, anonymous tip lines, and economic incentives for legal cultivation offered glimpses of potential change. Governments leveraged technology surveillance drones, data analytics, and financial monitoring to track shipments, map networks, and identify corruption. International cooperation became essential as the cartel's operations spanned borders and jurisdictions. Even so, the scale and sophistication of these organizations meant that total eradication remained elusive. The struggle for control was not only a law enforcement challenge, but a political and social one. Cartels exploited weak governance, poverty, and social inequality, embedding themselves in communities where the state's presence was minimal. They became, in some areas, the de facto authority, enforcing contracts, resolving disputes, and providing basic services in exchange for loyalty or compliance. In doing so, they complicated the line between villain and necessary evil, blurring the ethical and practical considerations for policymakers. Ultimately, Chapter 4 underscores a harsh truth. The shadow economy is not just a criminal problem. It is a systemic one. It thrives wherever there is demand, opportunity, and weak oversight, feeding on social inequality, corruption, and human desperation. The cartel's resilience and adaptability are amplified by the very systems that govern legitimate society. While raids, arrests, and interdictions are necessary, they are insufficient alone. Lasting change requires understanding the network's operational genius, addressing the social and economic conditions that allow them to flourish, and coordinating global efforts to disrupt both supply and demand. Boom. As the chapter closes, the picture is clear. The modern cartel is more than a gang or a criminal syndicate. It is a transnational enterprise with sophisticated logistics, financial acumen, and strategic foresight, operating within a global ecosystem that tolerates, enables, and often inadvertently protects it. The human cost, lives lost, communities destabilized, and institutions corrupted is staggering. But so is the ingenuity and organizational power of these networks. To confront them requires more than force. It requires insight, coordination, and an acknowledgement that the shadow economy exists because the world allows it to. The world of cartels is a mirror to our global society. a reflection of ingenuity, ambition, and the relentless drive for profit, stripped of legality and morality. From the jungles of Colombia to the streets of Mexico, from encrypted servers to cargo-laden ports, these networks have evolved into enterprises that rival legitimate corporations in sophistication, scale, and adaptability. They have learned to blend technology with human intelligence, logistics with coercion, and strategy with violence. Yet for every success story of operational brilliance, there is a trail of human suffering, families displaced, communities destabilized, and lives lost form the hidden ledger of this enterprise. Corruption, addiction, and fear permeate regions where the state's reach is limited, reinforcing the power of these organizations and complicating every attempt at reform. The cartels do not operate in a vacuum. They exploit weaknesses in governance, social inequality, and global demand, showing that the shadow economy is as much a societal problem as it is a criminal one. Law enforcement and governments continue to fight an uphill battle. Raids, arrests, and interdictions disrupt operations temporarily, but the network's resilience, adaptability, and global scope allow them to rebound, often stronger than before. It is a game of chess played on a continent-spanning board, where every move is countered with innovation, strategy, and relentless determination. Traditional tactics alone are insufficient. Understanding the systems, anticipating their adaptations, and addressing underlying social and economic conditions are essential to meaningful disruption. The story of the cartels is also a story of lessons. They demonstrate the power of organization, the effectiveness of strategic planning, and the value of adaptability principles that, if harnessed legally, could create prosperity instead of destruction. They remind us that wherever there is demand, ingenuity will find a way to supply it, and wherever there is inequality, opportunity will be exploited. The shadow economy thrives because the world, knowingly or unknowingly, allows it to. In the end, the fight against cartels and the shadow economy is not only about law enforcement or policy. It is about understanding complexity, addressing systemic vulnerabilities, and recognizing that criminal enterprise is often a symptom of broader societal challenges. These networks endure not because they are invincible, but because they have mastered the art of operating in the cracks of human systems, exploiting flaws, and adapting faster than those who would stop them. To confront them requires more than force. It requires insight, coordination, and a willingness to address the uncomfortable truths they expose about our globalized world. The shadow economy is vast, sophisticated, and enduring, but so too is the potential for societies to reclaim the systems it exploits through awareness, reform, and relentless pursuit of justice. Only by understanding the architecture of the criminal enterprise can we begin to dismantle it, and in doing so, protect the millions caught in its orbit.